is everyone, a small group, but a fun group, the best people, Ron and Arlene. Welcome, Michael. Today, of course, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the Jewish, what you could call it, Jewish mafia or Jewish organized crime. I know a lot of you have stories and may have personal information beyond what we'll be speaking about, because obviously it's an interesting topic for us, but as we know, the Jewish mafia, which was known during their time, kind of faded away, and Jews are not very famous for the mafia anymore. So we'll talk about it. We're going to talk basically about the American Jewish mafia. We're not going to talk about the Russian or Israeli one that's alive and well today, because I do not know.
I do not talk about it.
Yeah. I don't know. My connections are not what they used to be quite simple. So what we'll do first is we'll talk about why so many Jews went into the mafia. Then we'll talk about what it was like, talk about a few of the famous guys, and talk a little bit about what happened that ended the American mafia. So what's interesting, I think, about the American mafia, Jewish mafia, is it's eerily similar to every other profession in the Jewish world in many ways. What do I mean? One, why did Jews join the mafia? Well, the same reason Jews went into retail, the same reasons Jews went into factories, same reasons especially Jews went into boxing. Family came to America. You're either born as a kid here or born as a kid somewhere else. You arrive in America. You're living, of course, most likely in New York. You are living in a very small area with millions of Jews, separated by mere streets from different groups, the Irish, the Italians. If you cross into their neighborhood, you may have to fight. You often have to have a connection with Jewish gangs so that you don't get killed or hurt every time you walk down the street. You don't have a lot of money. There are some restrictions on Jews. And you're trying to find work in fields that have no limitations. If you want to be a lawyer, there's very limited who can be a lawyer. Want to be a doctor, although that opened up quickly. If you want to, you don't have money. If you want to go into accounting or banking, there was very limited options. And so you went towards fields, business fields that were open. One of them was retail, where you moved away to smaller towns around the country and worked in retail. Obviously, some went to boxing. A very similar amount of these Jews went into boxing, because obviously that was also a rough and tumble sport that had no limitations, because nobody cared. They would pay to see Jews fight, and they didn't care if they're watching Jews or Italians fight. There was no limitations. And so these, what we would call Jewish tough guys, and there's several books called Jewish tough guys, found that if they wanted to stay alive, if they wanted to thrive, they had to resort to the same thing that others have, and that is to, illegal things. So a lot of them started out as neighborhood gangs where they would rob from different places. Then they'd go into different fields, and we'll talk about that. One of the interesting things about the Jewish mafia was they were generally more educated, because obviously they could read their rights. Education had always been important in Jewish world, which gave them a little bit of an advantage over others who didn't have this knowledge of numbers, of how to read or write, didn't have the education behind them to organize. And so just as they went into these other fields, they went into this field of organized crime because there weren't that many options. Now, we'll learn later that whereas many of the other groups that went into crime, especially Italians, did something that the Jews didn't. And what do I mean? In the Italian mafia, you hear the phrase, the family, over and over again. How many of you have ever heard that phrase, the family?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So when you hear the phrase, the family, that is particular to the Italian mafia. It is not particular to the Jewish mafia. Why is that? because the Jewish mafia never connected itself as a family. In other words, if I was a mafia boss, I wanted my children to go to
Being off.
college, become lawyers and doctors, to do something else. It was not an idea that this was a family that we passed on the tradition to the next generation. So there are very few mobsters whose fathers were as well. So it usually was a one generation thing. So when Meyer Lansky died, his children were not in the mob, and so on for all the other famous ones. So this was generally a 1 or 2 generation deal. And by the time Jews, especially after World War II, when Jews were becoming, the world was becoming more open to Jews and we could get into different fields and we're more educated, the connections of Jews to the mafia pretty much dissipated and no new ones came into the field like we would consider in those families. Now, obviously, in other countries, especially Russia and Israel, that has developed one, but the American connection to the mafia for Jews dissipated and really started after World War II. And we'll talk a little bit also about the connection to World War II that the Jews played. So who was the Jewish mafia? You may have seen it in the TV and movies, the Jewish mob, the kosher mafia, the kosher nostra, which is what it's often referred to because it's an interesting name. Obviously connected to the Italian Cosa Nostra, that's why it's a play on words. The Unser Shtick, which I had not heard of, but that was kind of the Yiddish ways of calling it, the Unser Shtick. So there were various ones, but obviously most of them start in the late 19th century in New York, although there were ones all over. And we'll go over some of the names. Some of them are not real well known today, but at the time, they were very well known. And kind of like the first one, many believe, was a guy named Monk Eastman, who we're not sure if he was Jewish or not. And he competed with other gangs. So his Jewish gang competed with the Irish and Italian gangs. And again, this was what was going on for years before they all became connected. There was the Lenox Avenue gang, the Harry Gyp the Blood Horwitz gang, as he was running that. Herman Rosenthal was one of the famous early ones. And so, of course, these were smaller gangs in the 1900s, 19 teens, basically racketeering and a little bit of gambling and prostitution and all of these things that we think of. And there were gangs all over the place. So there was a wide range of them. And basically it was very similar to any other gang at the time. And yes, there were gangs in other places. They had gangs in all over New York. They had in Minneapolis was a big place, of course, Chicago. And as the times came and gone, these gangs would come and go, and everybody would have these wonderful names that today sound very fun, but back then were very scary, like Max Kid Twist, Zwerbach, or Big Jake Zelig, or Vach Cyclone Louis Lewis, or the Yiddish Black Hand, or Charlie the Cripple Ledowski. And so they had these wonderful names. And has anybody here read the Yiddish Policemen's Union?
That's the one in Alaska.
The one in Alaska,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful book. What's the name of the guy wrote? He won the.
I don't remember.
He won the Pulitzer for the.
Chabal, Chabol, I believe.
Yeah. Yes. Chabon or Chobin.
Yeah, that's right.
So in his book, in all the Jews who after World War II were allowed to go to Alaska. So there's millions of Jews in Alaska, and the story is based upon a detective. And what do they call the detective in this book? They call him a shamus, which is the basis for, like, we know what a shamus is. And that's what they call the detective in the book. So they took it from this. A pimp was a simcha. So, a simcha means celebration, but in this case, in the slums, it meant a pimp. If you did slamming, that means you hit somebody with an iron pipe. So they use all of this Yiddish because a lot of them spoke Yiddish. And as they went from petty crime in the early, some of them went into what we would call the racketeering and the labor unions, Dopey Benny Fane and Joe the Greaser Rosenzweig, one of my favorites. Kind of reminds me a lot of times of the boxing names like Slapsy Rosenblum, Maxie Slapsy Robinsboom, who was the light heavyweight champion. Don't we wish we were living in a time where everybody had a cool nickname? I'm just saying that right now. So I'll start thinking of yours. And some of them were, you know, they were also great names like for the others, like Johnny Spanish. And of course, Jacob Gura Shapiro. It sounds very funny for us to say these names with a straight face where they have these really scary names and their last name is Rosenzweig or Rothstein or Kaplan or Fine or Topolinsky or Zwerbach or Levinsky. Doesn't it just sounds weird to me? I don't know if it sounds weird to you. But again, you had to do what you had to do. And some of them stayed in this organized crime because they didn't have any other way of making a living. And some because they liked it. And so it kind of stayed in this Jewish mafia vein where you have mafia here and mafia there in different groups. Sometimes they worked together, sometimes they fought together. This would all change though, because we know that eventually the mob would become more organized. And what was the event that led to this organization? It was, many believe, Prohibition. So Prohibition came, and all of a sudden, there was a lot of money to be made, a lot more than before, because you would be selling alcohol to reputable people, and you now would be able to control the flow of this wonderful and valuable commodity. And so you needed people who could organize. And that's where Arnold Rothstein came in. How many of you heard of Arnold Rothstein?
Yes. we
He's
did.
one. We're going to talk about three of the most famous mafia bosses and these three are very different in who they were. And of course, Arnold Rothstein was what we would call the bright, organized, wealthy guy. So this is unusual because he did not come from a poor family. He came from a very wealthy family. And so what we see is a man who had options, who chose to go into this field. He was kind of like the black sheep of the family who loved gambling. And no matter what his family they couldn't get him out of that area. And so he went into gambling. And, you know, I think his brother became a rabbi or studied to become a rabbi. His father, I read, was called Abe the Just because he was a mathematician. No, let's see. No, I don't know if he was a mathematician, but he was out because of his upright, because he was a good guy. But Arnold Rothstein just simply said he always gambled, and so that's why he went into this area. And he ended up becoming one of the most powerful mob bosses of all time. And why? Because he was smart, wealthy, and organized. And he knew that he could create something new. And so what did he help create? He helped create this new thing called organized crime. So when you hear the phrase organized crime, you think of Arnold Rothstein. I mean, most of the time we think of him for something else, which we'll talk about, but he created the idea of organized crime where people would work together, especially the Jews working with the Italians. So instead of competing, he would work with them. And he ended up being a mentor to two very famous Italian mafia bosses and one very famous Jewish one. So he's kind of the mentor to Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, and of course also to Meyer Lansky. He is kind of like the last person to hold Tammany Hall together before LaGuardia came into New York. So this is a man who knew how to organize, how to be ruthless when he needed to, how to have people running all over the place, informants, people who were creating these bets, people who are sending alcohol from one place to the other. And so because of this, he became kind of like the kingpin of this mafia in the late teens and early 20s. So basically, he was an innocent businessman because I don't think he ever really went to jail, and I was just way too clever for that. He was famous for rigging horse races. He was famous for selling alcohol, for organized crime. He was kind of controlling Tammany Hall at the very end. He was, of course, very big into bootlegging and narcotics, which were his major areas. And his nicknames, as many of you know, were Mr. Big, the Fixer, the Man of Town, the Big Bankroll, and of course, the Brain. So he is kind of not the godfather in the way we know it, but certainly one of the first people to organize crime in a way that made it much more powerful. So he ended up being one of the wealthiest criminals. But what does he become most famous for? As we know, he becomes most famous, world famous for something else. And that, of course, is the rigging of the 1919 World Series. So the Black Sox scandal. Many people don't realize that there's not a lot of proof that he did it. And there's still a debate. What did you say? What did you say that? What? Somebody said something, I could hear it. Okay, nobody said, some people laughed. I thought I heard something. All right, never mind. Don't want to share the joke. I understand. So along with the speakeasies and bootlegging and that kind of stuff. Yes? Somebody was talking? All right, I hear somebody. Okay, that may just be my imagination. So along with all of this, bootlegging and narcotics, many people believe he was the first drug dealer, by the way. He had a very large criminal network. He had geniuses working under him, which helped him do all of the organizing. He had math geniuses who would help him organize the numbers, and that's what gave him a leg up on everybody else in many respects. He may or may not have fixed the World Series. That's what we know. So in 1919, the Cincinnati Reds defeat the Chicago White Sox. The White Sox were very big favorites. And of course, they lost. We do know that the person who was actually talking with the White Sox was a guy named Abe Attell, who had been a former boxing champion who did at times work with Rothstein. We know there was a man named Joseph Sullivan who was a gambler who was part of it as well, but there's no proof that Rothstein was part of it. It's all thought to be true because, one, he did make some money on it, but some believe he just knew about it, but he actually wasn't the one fixing it. He never was prosecuted. I mean, he never went to jail for it. The baseball players who fixed the World Series were not convicted. They were set free. They were kicked out of baseball by the new commissioner, Landis, but they didn't suffer prosecution for it. They were banned from the game, but they didn't go to jail, in other words. So some believe that he actually was the one who started it. Some believe he just is the man who gave permission for it to go down. And some believe that he just knew about it and made money on it. He won a lot of money, but he didn't win an incredible amount of money for him. So he won some money, but not like an incredible amount. So whether that was to keep the odds down or whatever. So he would be considered one of the most famous of all the Jewish gamblers. He was assassinated in 1928 because he owed somebody money from a poker game that he knew was rigged against him. However, we'll talk about why he may have actually been assassinated, because he possibly was assassinated by another Jewish mafia guy who hired somebody because Rothstein had killed one of his guys, but there was no proof if he was killed because he didn't pay this debt to George Hump McManus. But they do know that the game that he lost, and when he was, 3-day gambling spree that he lost, that it was fixed, and that a whole bunch of different men were due to receive money from it. And so, but after he died, basically his empire was broken up. And this is where, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel and those people start to take over by taking over his empire and taking it to another level. So when he died, also there's a belief that that pretty much was the end of Tammany Hall, because he was the one who was making it keep connected. And so it's also noted that when he died and his wealth was not there, so he may not have been as wealthy as people think, or years later all his money was gone after he died, so we don't know exactly how much he was worth. It's all estimated, but some estimate him that he would be worth 150 to 200 million dollars in today's money. So a lot of money, certainly for that world. Now, of course, he is depicted in several movies, and he's used as an example in several novels, most famously, of course, The Great Gatsby, where Gatsby's mentor is a Jewish guy, and it was described as the Jewish guy who fixed the World Series. So obviously that would be him. If you haven't seen 8 Men Out, that is probably the best movie about the fixing of the World Series. So if you haven't, has anybody seen that movie? If you haven't, it's an excellent movie about the fixing of the World Series. Of course, it centers on the players, but it's really interesting because the players were not paid. Only 2, I think, were paid, and the rest they just never gave them the money. So they ended up fixing the World Series and not getting any money. So, and one of the other reasons the World Series was fixed was because the owner of the White Sox, Kaminsky, was a cheapskate and refused to pay his players any money. And one of his best pitcher was going to be given, it was, I think it was Lefty, I forgot Lefty's last name. He was supposed to be given a huge bonus if he won 30 games. If you win 30 games, it's a lot. That's really good. And when he got to winning his 29th game, guess what his boss did? He didn't let him pitch anymore for the rest of the season. So basically, he couldn't get this huge bonus because they were already going to win. So Kaminsky, this cheap guy, led to this, but Rothstein may have been the brains behind it. He's also depicted in other movies like Casino, and of course, many more. Anybody have any thoughts or questions on him? Because we'll go to another mobster who was almost as famous, but famous for a different reason. Has everybody heard of Arthur Rothstein? Jeff.
Rabbi, who was running that poker game? Who's attributed? Was it Dutch Schultz or?
We'll get to that in a second. Now, Dutch Schultz was not running the game. However, many believe Dutch Schultz was the man who put out the hit on Rothstein.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
So he was not, he didn't, I don't think he directly ran it, but he had a hand in it. So the actual person was George McManus, who's, I think, either the person who may have been the person who killed him, or and also Titanic Thompson was one of the other guys who was part of it as well. And I don't think they ever proved who killed him, but many assume that it was Dutch Schultz who put out the hit. Now, Dutch Schultz is the next person we'll talk about. Dutch Schultz is another famous mafia boss who dies young, just like Rothstein. He dies in his 30s. Rothstein was in his 40s. Dutch Schultz is different than Rothstein because he was more well known for some other reasons. What was he most well known for? He was most well known for being a brutal and heartless killer. That's what he was known as. He was one of the worst of all the mafiosos. Sometimes when we talk about the Jewish mob, we think about, Meyer Lansky, this old man who's not allowed to go into Israel, or Arnold Rothstein, this debonair guy who wore very nice suits. Rothstein is the guy who basically Rothstein dressed up, unlike all the other criminals. And then the criminals started dressing like him. So when you see all those criminals dressed really nicely in the 30s, it's all because of Rothstein, because he presented himself as a businessman with organized crime. And so everybody else, especially Lucky Luciano, Myers Lansky, and Frank Costello, started doing it too, and Al Capone. And so whenever you see them in pictures, what are they looking like? They're all wearing these really nice suits, these really cool hats. And that's all because of Rothstein. Rothstein kind of set the precedent. Dulce Schultz is not thought in that vein. Dulce Schultz is known as a rough and tumble, horrible man who would kill anybody and torture anybody.
Yeah, Rabbi.
Yes.
I believe at that time, wasn't the Jewish mob called Murder Incorporated?
That's exactly right. We'll talk about that in a second. It wasn't just the Jewish mob, but they organized everybody together. It becomes Murder Incorporated. And that is a good, your father wasn't part of that, or grandfather, was he?
Oh, it's funny. Her grandmother, who was really in with the mob more than the grandfather, she would never talk about her family to Arlene.
Really?
And so we don't know to what extent they were involved, but they were involved because of, like I mentioned to you before you came on, that she was the only woman allowed in their poker games at the Schwitz in Brooklyn, which was the hot sauna baths.
What was her name, by the way?
Sadie Hammerman.
Sadie Hammerman.
Yeah,
That
now
sounds
she's
like an
famous.
Yeah.
And what? So,
that's okay.
but we can go back to that. One of the big moments in this, of course, was the combining of the Italian and the Jewish mobs, which happened pretty much after Prohibition. And a lot of that was, of course, Rothstein, and then later these guys who brought them together. And the idea was we can be organized and we can do a lot more. So Rothstein is basically considered like the Moses of the gay Jewish gangsters. And he's the poster boy for what Jewish gangsters should look like, even though he was ruthless. Don't get me wrong. He was very ruthless and not afraid to have somebody killed if needed. But he was not Dutch Schultz, who may have been one of these people who just really enjoyed it. So Dutch Schultz, unlike Rothstein, was an immigrant who did not come from a wealthy family. He came from a poor family, and like many others, this was an area he started as a small-time mobster, robbing casinos or craps games, and 18 went to prison. And in prison, he was like the worst prisoner. He was the prisoner everybody was afraid of, so they had to kind of put him off to the side, kept trying to get out. He broke out of prison, was captured in Dutch Store. His name was not Schultz, by the way, it was Arthur Simon Flegenheimer, which you can understand why he would want to change that name. He took Schultz because he was working for Schultz Trucking at one point after his release from parole. And Dutch is also Deutsch, which is kind of means Dutch. So, I mean, Deutsch, what does Deutsch mean? It's Deutsch means, I just forgot.
German.
It's German, and what it means German. It means German. Sorry, not Dutch. It actually means German. So, so of course he's German. His parents were from Germany, and he was from Germany. So Dutch Schultz. So he started off as like a bouncer. But because he had such a reputation for brutality, he ended up rising in the ranks. Are you guys hearing the feedback? Or is it
Yes,
just
a
me?
big echo.
Yes.
Try muting everybody and then we can come on one at a time.
Okay, that may be because of the YouTube. Let me try it. Let me see if this works. Do we hear? Are we still hearing it? Do people hear it? All right, nobody's hearing it. Okay, good. All right, so if you want to come on, you can unmute yourselves. So that's sorry about that. So Schultz, as opposed to the more refined Rothstein, was a rough and tumble, ruthless man who was not afraid to do anything. He killed people, he hijacked, he bootlegged, he did everything that was needed to get higher and higher. Most famously, they were in, they had some issues with a group that would not buy their alcohol. And so they kidnapped one of the leaders, one of the brothers of this group, and they hung him by his nails, by his toenails. And then they wrapped his eyes in a bandage that had been smeared with someone's discharge who had gonorrhea. And so that's how they convinced them to start buying alcohol from them. And of course, the man was blind after that. So he was also inventive in his cruel ways. And eventually they took over a lot of the area. So they went from the Bronx to Manhattan. Of course, I don't know New York very well, so all these are just names for me. But after that, they eventually were powerful enough to compete with the five families that we've heard about so much. Now, did he kill Rothstein? We don't know. But but Dutch Schultz again was very aggressive, to say the least. And some say he did have Rothstein killed, others didn't, but it's interesting to think the Jews were all connected and worked together, but that is not true. It is believed that it was a retribution for the killing of Dutch Schultz's attorney. And so that's why Rothstein was killed. So they weren't, all of the Jewish gangsters were not necessarily working together. Some of them were in competition with each other, just like anybody else. But he was known as the most violent. And he ended up in several gang wars, one a very bloody one with some of his own lieutenants. And eventually he was killed. The reason he was killed was because he was under indictment, and by a guy named Thomas Dewey, who of course became very famous, and he was spending a lot of money on his defense, and he was taking the money from his defense from the people he was paying to work for him, and they were not happy about it. They weren't happy about being paid less money, and so eventually got into war and he was killed. He was famous. His money came from racketeering and from gambling, obviously, and he had a numbers racket that was very well known, something called the Pick 3 lotteries. And if anybody's been in New York, it's kind of like the lottery here, except he figured out a way to make sure that whoever won, he was still making money. So he made sure that whatever the numbers were, they made sure he was picking money. So again, he was a guy who wore lots of pistols and was really, now, anybody else have any idea of heard of him? Okay, so he was not working with Lucky Luciano or Meyer-Lansky, but of course they knew each other and they worked together, and sometimes they had agreements together. And one of the agreements they had was that nobody would try and kill the U.S. Attorney Thomas Dewey, the one who was prosecuting him. So basically, Schultz asked the National Crime Syndicate to have him assassinated.
Right.
And they said no, because they felt if they assassinated a US attorney, that the results would be quite traumatic to their world. That was just something you didn't do, I guess. And so he actually tried to have him assassinated himself. And obviously it didn't work. And of course, he was then assassinated with some of his underlings. So what's also interesting is that when he was taken to the hospital, I don't think he refused, as did Rothstein, to name who killed him. So Rothstein, especially when he was brought in, refused to name, saying, basically, I'm going to die as I lived, and refused to tell anyone who killed him. And I think Dutch Schultz was the same. Now, Dutch Schultz was very wealthy. Some say he was worth up to $150 million in today's money. However, he is not as famous as Lansky or Rothstein or the others, because he hasn't had as many movies about him. And the ones that he has had are not as famous. The Cotton Club and Billy Bathgate were, he was a character in The Untouchables on one episode, but you haven't seen the major motion pictures about him. So that have been really successful and won Academy Awards. So, but anytime you see a over the top, horrible villain who is a mafiosa, they could be representing Dutch Schultz. And so, any questions about him? Because I want to make sure to get to the most famous of all the Jewish mobsters. Okay, so have you guys heard of Dutch Schultz?
Oh, sure.
Okay, good. I just put him because he's the most ruthless. Instead, I was going to do Bugsy Siegel, but a lot of people know about Bugsy Siegel because of the movies. Right. The most famous, of course, of all the Jewish mafiosas is, of course, Meyer Lansky, who was born Meyer Sokolansky, sometimes known as the mob's accountant. Right. Very close friends, childhood friends with Bugsy Siegel. Very good friends with Lucky Luciano, was one of the people who worked to put the Jewish mob and the Italian mob together. One of the most respected of all of them, and unique in the fact that he is one of the few that died at an old age. Despite what we saw in The Godfather Part 2, he was not assassinated. He died at home. So Meyer Lansky, of course, same thing. He's from Eastern Europe, moved here when he was a kid, became very good friends with Benjamin Siegel, who of course would become known as Bugsy, and they would start the Bugs and Meyer mob. And I remember I was in, I don't know if I've told you the story. Oops, I was in going to a function in Dallas, and I was walking in. It was it was a home for adults, Jewish adults who had mental disabilities. And I was talking to guys, last name was Siegel.
I think we knew.
And I said, oh, like the mob guy? He said, yes, Bugsy Siegel was my grandfather. And I was like, I said, really, Bugsy Siegel? He did say, he said, yeah, what was his name? Benny Siegel was my grandfather. I said, really, Bugsy Siegel was your grandfather? And then he got so upset. Started telling me, Bug? A bug is this, a bug is that. Why are you calling me a bug? Why are you calling my grandfather Bug? And almost threatened to hit me because he was so upset that I called his grandfather Bugsy Siegel. It turns out that that is actually a scene from the movie Bugsy Siegel, Bugsy. And this guy was actually just kind of like a lunatic who pretended he was his grandson and used to do this to people because he was a little off his rocker. But he was actually not Bugsy Siegel's grandson. But I just thought that was funny that I saw the movie and I said, wait a minute, this is almost exactly what this guy told me. So now we think of Meyer Lansky as the accountant of the mob, but him and Bugsy Siegel had one of the most violent gangs, as did Dutch Schultz, although Dutch Schultz, of course, had more of a reputation. But Meyer Lansky was very aggressive too. And it's just that he and Luciano had this idea, along after Rothstein really, to create this national crime syndicate that would span the country. And so that's what they did. They formed this, especially after Rothstein died. They took over the rest of his, along with Frank Costello and people like Johnny Torrio. And they created this national crime syndicate that went from one coast to the other. They had, of course, Al Capone was part, and they were the men who started investing in Las Vegas. Of course, the famous Flamingo Hotel, which, of course, that's why Bugsy Siegel died. And they were everywhere, basically. Why did they become more famous or more liked? Because one, they actually worked with the United States government during World War II to ensure that the Nazis did not invade by water. So they were in charge in many of the ports to make sure that the Nazis didn't come in through those ports, and that anybody who might be a Nazi was apprehended. So most people, that's why I think they got this kind of nice reputation. And also because before the war, they liked to go up and beat up Nazis. So they were not, it was not unreasonable of them to go up into a Nazi rally and just start beating up and chasing people away. So,
Rabbi,
yes.
what happened there, Lucky Luciano was going to be, was in prison. And because of what you just said, the government made a deal with him that if he protects the New York port, they will let him out of prison, but he would have to be sent to Italy,
Right.
which he agreed to, and that's what happened there.
Yeah, and it was actually him and Lansky, especially Lansky, who was such good friends. He said, "I will only do this if you let Lucky Luciano out." They said, "Okay, we'll let him out, but he's got to leave the country." And that's right. And that's, I mean, it's amazing that the government worked with these criminals because they knew they had, they obviously they needed them. So it was war. What can you do? So what then, of course, happened was two famous incidents. One is Bugsy Siegel is, of course, assassinated. Now, Meyer Lansky they had been good friends since childhood, maybe even best friends. Did Lansky have Siegel killed? Probably not, but he probably okayed it because he had asked the commission to over and over again to give Siegel a second chance, a third chance. They were losing money on this Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. And eventually they all just told Lansky that you need to say it's okay because it's time. And so Lansky, to the day of his death, said if it had been my choice, he would have never been killed. But so obviously couldn't stop it, is more likely. But of course, he became very famous with the conference in which he brought all these mob bosses to what country? Of course, Cuba. So Cuba was his heyday. He created a way for them to have a stake in an entire country. And so he became good friends with Batista. He helped arrange Batista to remain in power in exchange for a lot of money and for giving them free reign. So Batista basically had a hand in everything. They made sure he was paid. But in the post-World War II conference, the first big mob conference in almost 15 years, he invited everybody there. And of course, the main man there was Lucky Luciano because Luciano was not allowed back in America, but he was in Cuba. But you had the Trafficante there, who would of course become the mob bosses, and a lot of the others, including Frank Costello and some of these other, my favorite, of course, is, Trigger Happy Charlie. I think that's a great name. And the Mad Hatter, that's another one. And so he's the one who organized and helped to create this money laundering organization in Havana. And they were making money hand over fist. And so was Batista. And then we all know what was going on. They had famous actors going down there and famous and baseball players and Ernest Hemingway and all these people were going down there because it was legal to gamble. And so they were making a money hand over fist. Meyer Lansky was considered by many to be the richest mafia guy in the world. And we all know how that stopped. Lansky actually got out the day before Castro took over. What does this all remind us of? Of course, The Godfather Part 2. As we know, several of the characters in The Godfather Part 1 and Part 2 are based on Meyer Lansky. Sidney Green, the man who's assassinated at the airport, is supposed to be Meyer Lansky. But of course, he wasn't assassinated, but he lost almost all his money, many people believe, in the Cuban Revolution because he had all his money in Havana. He did have some money still coming out of Vegas, but his reputation for being wealthy may have been exaggerated because he may not have been. And by the time he died, he didn't have the money many people thought. The FBI believed he had over $300 million hidden somewhere, but they never found it. One of the reasons is that he kept his money in the name of others. So when he died, the only money they could find that he owned was $57,000, and he died in 1983. So officially, all he had was $57,000. Many people say he had more money, that it was just with different people. Others say he was very rich. Others say he wasn't because he lost all his money in Cuba. He did flee to Israel, and he was never convicted of anything beyond, I think, gambling. He fled to Israel when he was indicted. He came back, he was deported back, and then he was acquitted, not allowed to go back to Israel, and he kind of died, of course, obviously, in Miami, very famously. I don't know if any of you ever saw him, but somebody was telling me, which one of you, somebody was telling me that you walked by his house.
Yes. We were visiting Arlene's grandparents who were in Florida at the time. And her grandfather took Arlene and said, "That's Meyer's house." But an interesting story, at that time, after that, we were in Miami reading the Miami Herald, and Meyer Lansky's grandson was suing Castro regime to get back what Castro took the property away that Meyer Lansky owned. It was very interesting.
And I think that was actually really recently, his grandson did it as well.
Yeah.
That case may be still be going because, so Hyman Roth, of course, not Hyman Roth, was the character played by Lee Strasberg in The Godfather Part 2. Does everybody remember that?
Right.
Yes.
The old man who thinks he's never going to die. And after Lansky saw the movie, he called Strasberg to congratulate him for such a good performance and asked him, "Why didn't you make me a little bit more sympathetic?" And also the phrase "we're bigger than US Steel"
Right.
that the character said in the movie is something that Lansky actually said.
Yeah.
And that's something he actually said in real life. But he, of course, is alluded to in many, many films. The best, of course, are the two Godfather ones, and also the famous movie Bugsy. Bugsy Siegel is supposed to be modeled for Mo Green, who in The Godfather Part 1 is the Vegas crime boss who was killed. That was supposed to be Bugsy Siegel. And there's a variety of other ones. Ben Kingsley was actually nominated also playing Meyer Lansky, as Lee Strasberg was. So again, he's kind of become known as like the accountant, the poster boy for Jewish mafiosos. This debonair guy who is only ruthless when he has to be, always treats people with respect. And of course, that's kind of a myth. What really happened is as time went on, especially after World War II, but even before, Jews were becoming more assimilated and more acculturated into America. And so they didn't want to be connected to this illegal mafia activity. It was a big embarrassment. So they stopped talking about it and stopped making it a big deal. And as people became lawyers and doctors and businessmen, their children did not grow up in these difficult neighborhoods, so they had no reason to try and go into this field. I mean, certainly they're here and there, some did. People like Dutch Schultz some of the Jews ended up converting. Like he converted to Catholicism so he could work with the Italian mafia. And he was buried in a Catholic cemetery against the protests of his mother, who wanted him buried in a Jewish cemetery, but he had been baptized. So it became like a secret we didn't want to talk about anymore. And by the time of the 50s and 60s, where Jews are part of the civil rights movement and we're getting more and more freedom, there weren't that many of them left. Obviously Meyer Lansky, but of course he's one of the few who lived past the heyday where everybody was killed. So there just weren't that many. However, in the Italian world, it stayed part of their legacy, passed down through the family. So sometimes family members, although in The Godfather, of course, Don Corleone wants his youngest son, Michael, to go to college, to become a senator, to be somebody respectable, like all the Jews wanted their kids to do. And so now, of course, the Russian mafia is a little different because the Russian Jewish mafia is much more connected to the regular Russian mafia as opposed to being Jewish, of course, because they didn't have religion in the Soviet Union for so long. But any questions or thoughts on any of these characters? There are a lot of them. We touched on some of the other ones, of course, Bugsy Siegel, of course, Abe Adel.
Susan, I'll call you back. Okay.
There were,
bye.
I don't know, there were a lot of them. Now, many people think that there was a high percentage of Jews who were in the mafia. However, the percentages were less than the percentage of Jews in that area. So in other words, a third of the New York may have been Jewish, but only a sixth of the mafia was Jewish. And not a very high percentage of Jews were in jail who were in the mafia. So, but there's a lot of them who were indicted, and it's just a whole different, I mean, if you go through the list, there's just one after the other of people. Of course, if you have a cool nickname, but from basically in every aspect of it, there were, especially bootlegging, obviously, that's where they started making real money. Any questions or thoughts? Jeff?
Rabbi, interesting, Meyer Lansky's son did not follow in his father's shoes. He separated out and went to West Point.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he had a long career in the Army. I believe he retired as a colonel. But his father was very proud of him, really didn't want him to be connected with the mob at all. And his son followed a completely different path.
Did he change his name? I don't remember that. Did he change his name?
I don't believe so. I believe it was
yeah, I read it a while.
It was in one of the books. I can't remember which one. And
I read a biography, but I don't remember.
I haven't fact checked it, so I believe that's the case though.
So when it comes to ideas like organized crime and the Italian mafia, you got to understand there's all these connections with the Jews, 5 families. Eventually, as the Jewish involvement in the mob became less and less. Jews were still involved, but they weren't usually known as the leaders anymore, except for a few here and there, because obviously there just weren't that many of them anymore. But those three, Arthur Rothstein and Meyer Lansky and Dutch Schultz, are three of the most powerful, most famous. And there's a lot of cool names. So if you look through, Abe Bernstein's Purple Gang, and of course it's just nonstop awesome nicknames. And then I'll be sending all of you your nicknames pretty soon.
This is a very interesting book, The Five Families. Tells you all about the mobs and everything. It's really excellent.
Who wrote it? I've heard.
Selwyn Rabb. Wait, wasn't that Selwyn Rabb? Didn't Jonathan Rabb say that's his
That may have been
one of
his
his
father.
relatives?
Yeah, maybe it was grandfather. How do
Yeah,
you spell it? Selwyn?
I thought he mentioned that name.
No, that Selwyn Rabb. I think he may have been a distant relative because it spells it differently.
R-A-A-B.
Yeah, he's a journalist.
Yeah.
I think he certainly kind of looks like him. I think they are related. I think he did mention it. We'll have to ask him.
Yeah, hey, look, see? He does look like him.
Yeah, especially if you look at the younger pictures of him. I just looked him up.
Yeah.
Well, the only mob, I have no mob connections, but my great uncle was arrested and went to jail in Tulsa for selling pornography in his mid 80s. So that's the only story we have in my family. He was like in his mid 80s. That's why it was so funny.
Another interesting point, the reason why Bugsy Siegel was killed was because he skimmed off $2 million from the Flamingo, which he gave to his girlfriend, who left the United States for Europe. She thought she would be safe. Well, it took 2 years, and she mysteriously was killed in an automobile accident.
Yep. And those things happen when you deal with the mob.
Rabbi, I just looked it up, and yes, his oldest son, Paul, was a West Point
Yeah.
graduate. What I didn't know was his youngest son graduated from the Air Force Academy.
So pretty impressive.
Yeah,
I mean, that was pretty much the way it was done. You did not want your kids to, I don't know,
Right.
very few kids of mob figures who stayed in the mob.
It sounds like, sadly, Judaism is not well represented in organized crime currently, but in somebody that does come to mind, a little different and probably less colorful, is Bernie Madoff. I'm just wondering if he or anyone else sees a connection to this great tradition of Jewish crime.
Yeah, again, what we also have to learn is that these criminals were not doing it to others, they were doing it to Jews as well. So when they were racketeering and killing, and they were doing it to Jews and non-Jews. And so, of course, Bernie Madoff, who has taken more money from Jews than any other person in history, I don't know if he's a mob boss, but he really would be that type of character.
I'm impressed, when you look at the annals of Jewish finance, you see people like Robert Rubin, Alan Greenstein, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, and then of course Madoff, to kind of balance the achievements.
And the Milkins from California, that was the famous name from the 80s.
Yeah.
Although Michael Milken, when he got out of jail, spent the rest of his life helping causes. So he did right at he's still living, I think.
Yeah.
Sid? I heard. Yeah, Harriet, I think we've lost you. We just can't hear you. Sorry about that. I think it's on your end. You are not on mute, but we just can't hear you. You want to just check your microphone settings. Flossie.
Were there any female gangsters?
That's a good question. I did not remember reading about any female gangsters. I don't think there were that many any women, not Jewish women. So that'd be interesting. I never looked that up. That's a good question. That's a really good question.
Harriet,
I think they'd be really good.
Harriet, could you mute now because whatever you're fiddling with is echoing back.
Yeah.
I don't think she can hear us.
All right. Harriet, I muted everybody because once somebody was giving feedback, so I apologize. So that's a little bit, I'm not looked up anything on Jewish female mafia, but the last thing we'll talk about is if there is something of an American mafia today, it is connected, of course, unfortunately, to the ultra-Orthodox world. So in that world, they would have what we would call some sort of mafia still today. Many have been arrested, extortion, a wide range of bribery. So it's not all of them, but it's certainly many. We just saw a lot of us saw Unorthodox. The Satmar has several people who are indicted for doing this. One of the things they do is it's kind of a two-way street. In the ultra-Orthodox world, a woman cannot ask for a divorce.
Right.
Right.
And that gives the man an inordinate amount of power. Ron, if you want me to divorce from your daughter, you have to give me $10 million. And there's nothing you can do if you want your daughter to be safe from me because I beat her, you have to give me $10 million. And give me an extra 5, I'll give you the kids. And that's the kind of power men have. And so what you have to do is if Ron, you don't want to pay me $10 million, what do?
You go to the rabbis in New Jersey,
Exactly. And what do?
they put a hit on you.
Yeah, they either.
If you don't give the woman a get.
That's right. You pay them instead. You pay them $250,000 to rough me up. I give the gets. I get broken legs, and everybody's happy except for me. So
Actually, there was a case, I'm thinking maybe 5 years ago, where a woman wanted a get and the husband refused. And
Right.
I guess it was a fairly ugly situation, but the community threatened to exile the husband if he didn't do it.
and that is the
woman
best way to
actually
do
got
it.
a get.
That's how you.
It's very unusual.
That's what you're supposed to do. That's like the real way to do it in a
Yeah.
community. So
Yeah.
that's what traditionally you're supposed to do is the community is supposed to get together and threaten to ostracize the person if he doesn't. So that goes way back, and that's still done a lot. But in some places, if the person says, if he continues to say no, I remember I saw this on an episode of The Sopranos, where years ago, and I didn't watch that much of it, but a guy who owned a couple of like motels hired, what was his name? Soprano, what's his name? Tony Soprano, to convince his son-in-law to divorce his daughter. And he did, but he ended up taking half of the motels in exchange. So the guy wasn't thrilled with the deal. But again, it's very interesting. It's very fun to talk about it in the past. We know if you're living it, it's a whole different world. So I'm sure they enjoyed it in some ways, but in some ways it's very scary. And it's today, of course, as we've seen, you can make a lot more money doing a lot of other things besides organized crime. So that's one of the reasons why there's not as many educated Jews there, because I can become an engineer and I'll make the same kind of money, or I can become a doctor and make the same kind of money, or I can be invest in an internet company and become way more rich than there's never been a mafia boss, official mafia boss, that's been worth 50 billion if you don't count Putin and and Madoff. All right, so that was really interesting. I hope you enjoyed it.
It
Now,
was very nice.
Yes.
and that, of course, is a really interesting. Now, the question is, what do we want to do? Do we want to set a schedule of different things, or do we want to go on some sort of topic? Like we talked about doing other things, but this is the last thing that we organized together so far. So we've done Jews in sports, prime ministers. We did a review of Among the Living. And my two, is anyone have, I know Flossie had talked about Jewish taboos and what was it? What was the other, what's the word? Taboos and
Superstitions.
superstitions. Thank you. That could be it. That's certainly one class. Do we want to just keep doing these one individual class, or do we
Yeah,
want to
that-
have an
that-
overarching thing?
That sounds interesting, what Flossie
Yeah, we could do
suggested.
that. We'll do that next
Yeah.
week.
I agree.
Do you want to pick a new topic every week for the next week?
Sure.
Okay, so we'll just
Yeah.
go week to week.
You can also pick Jews in medicine.
Jews in medicine would be. a
We could
good
do that. Are there Jews in medicine? Wow. it's too many things
I
all the
think that'll
time.
be a
Boy,
series.
that's unique.
Jews in medicine, yeah. So we'll do Jews in Jewish taboos and superstitions next week.
That's
And then the week after, we'll do Jews, and we won't just do medicine, we'll do like medical research, obviously. as
Right,
well,
right.
In medicine.
Right.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Rob.
Always
Thank
an absolute
you.
pleasure.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Have a
you.
good week.
We
Have
don't
a
have,
good day. Stay
reminder,
safe.
we don't have the 1 o'clock history class anymore. That class finished last week.
Right.
We'll still have the 3 o'clock podcast.
That is the podcast today. That's your
Yeah,
next thing.
podcast will be today.
And
Okay.
Rabbi, tonight is the discussion of shared legacies that we told you
Is
about.
that's today, Wednesday? Yes, tonight is shared
8 o'clock.
8
8
p.m.
o'clock. And
Yes.
if you haven't seen it, watch it beforehand. Because I think you can still watch it all today.
Or half today, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
All right,
Thanks. As
thank
always,
you.
you're awesome.
Okay,
safe,
thank you,
everyone.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye now.
Good to see you,
Bye.
Terry.
Bye, Mike.
Bye, Carol.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye,
Terry.
everybody. Bye, Grandpa. Bye, John Boy.
He's
Good night,
so
Mom.
funny. You're too funny.